I was an addict. I denied it for a long time, came up with excuses as to why what I was doing was okay, convinced myself that it wasn't hurting anyone, so it didn't really matter, all the typical justifications that are shouted up from the depths of a downward spiral. When Dad noticed, he attributed it to middle child syndrome and said it was a ploy for attention. My mom shrugged it off, figuring there were worse things. My brothers were too busy being perfect to comment. Mom was right, in a way. It wasn't like I was selling myself on street corners for meth or anything. There were definitely worse things than eating myself sick constantly. What had started as comfort eating to deal with a combination of poor self-esteem and bullying slowly morphed into a need, a craving, an itch I couldn't quite scratch. I couldn't look at food without feeling the urge to shove it in my mouth in a vain attempt to fill the emptiness that churned in my gut. And when I did give in, there was such a rush and the desire was quieted, even if only temporary. I felt so guilty, knew what I was doing was wrong, and that just made me want to do it even more. I was caught in a vicious circle of self-hatred, and the only thing that could make me feel any better was eating. It got embarrassing fast. I tried to be discreet, eating normal portions in front of others, but then gorging myself behind closed doors until I feel like I would vomit. I couldn't look in a mirror without wanting to cry. My face was becoming rounder, my clothes becoming harder to put on, tighter. My brothers asked if I was retaining too much water. That was their idea of tact. Dad was even more blunt about it. "You are getting really fat," he said over breakfast one morning. Kevin and Jason feigned interest in their cereal, but I could see their amused smirks. I swallowed back tears and shrugged. I'd never been thin, something Dad had prioritized, and it was a sore point between us. It didn't matter what he tried, what he said he could do. I could just never get to the same ideal size that he and my brothers were. "It's disgusting. It's lazy. It's sloppy. Is that what you want people to think of you, of your family? You're almost 17, for God's sake." "No," I mumbled. "Then what are you gonna do about it?" "I'm trying, Dad. Trying to embarrass me? Because you're doing a good job of that. Kathy Maloney saw you at the pool club last week, and you know what she said to me? She said it looked like you were really enjoying taking the summer off and relaxing. She was so snide. I just wanted to crawl into a rock and die, Nick." "Sorry. If you're so sorry, then put down the spoon and go for a run." I did run, all the way up to my room, where I locked myself in and dug out the stash of snacks I kept hidden in the back of my closet. I sat on my floor and tried to drown out Dad's cold, angry words with a loud crunch of chips and candy, but it only made them louder. I caught sight of myself in the mirror hanging on the back of my door, and I paused, my hand still in a bag of mini Snickers. Dad was right. I was a pig. Gross, unlovable, ugly pig. How lucky was I then, when he told me a few days later that he had a solution. "If you won't fix it, I will." He had come into my room while I was cleaning and tossed a few pamphlets on my bed. I picked one up and skimmed the front page. "Fat camp?" I asked, a sickening feeling bubbling up in the back of my throat. "It's one of the top-rated programs in the country, for guys like you." "I'll go to the gym. I'll work out every day." "Yeah, you will, at fat camp." When I tried to recruit Mom to my side later that night, she let me down and let me cry against her shoulder. She knew about how strained my relationship was with my dad, and she sympathized, but she was a pushover. She couldn't stand up to him any more than I could. "Maybe it will be good for you, sweetie," she said gently. "You'll get out of the house, meet new people, try new activities. It could be fun." "He hates me," I said flatly. I had known it for a long time, but never said it out loud before. "No, he doesn't. Your dad loves you. That's why he cares so much about your weight. He wants you to be healthy. He wants me to be skinny." "Nick! I'm going to bed, Mom. Good night." The morning I left for camp, Dad let me eat whatever I wanted for breakfast. He considered it a last meal of sorts. Despite the queasy knots in my stomach, I managed to scarf down French toast, bacon, sausage, eggs, and a bowl of strawberries. Dad forced a smile, although I could tell he was repulsed. He gave me a pat on the shoulder as I headed out to the car with Mom. "Your brothers wanted to say goodbye, but they aren't back yet. They went for a jog. We'll see you in 6 weeks. Good luck." The drive upstate was long and quiet. Mom made a few attempts at conversation, but I didn't want to talk. I just wanted to get the ride done and over with. The camp was beautiful, I admitted grudgingly to myself as we pulled up. A lake sparkled invitingly from behind a row of log cabins, neat paths wound off into trees, and colorful flags and banners had been erected all around, welcoming the newest campers to their home for the next month and a half. As soon as we'd parked, a bright, over-bubbly man practically pulled me from the car into a bro hug. "Hey man, I'm Derek, a counselor. What's your name?" "Nick Mass." He scanned his clipboard and tapped it twice enthusiastically when he found my name. "Ah, here you are. You're in cabin 3 with Ash. If you want to grab your stuff, I'll take it over on for you." Mom gave me a tight hug and whispered, "If it's horrible, call me. I'll come get you." "Thanks," I said, but I knew she wouldn't. I was assigned a bunk and given just enough time to unpack before they ushered us into a large dining hall. I was surrounded by the other guys, all of whom looked as excited as I was about being there, and I felt the familiar twinges of nerves that set in whenever I was faced with a new situation. I wanted nothing more than to go home, curl up in my favorite pajamas, and eat. My stomach rumbled in agreement. The counselors introduced themselves and did their best to be upbeat in the face of such a reluctant crowd, which didn't have any effect. Apparently fat camp wasn't anyone's idea of fun summer getaway. After an awkward skit about making new friends, they served lunch. Turkey burgers on whole wheat buns, a garden salad, steamed broccoli, and a popsicle for dessert. I was still famished when the meal was over, but they shuffled us out the door to go to a series of icebreaker activities. By the time dinner rolled around, I'd become friendly with a couple of guys from my cabin and was starting to think, hey, maybe camp wouldn't be so horrible after all. We were given a disappointingly small portion of fish and rice to eat, and halfway through, I noticed that I was unusually sleepy. It had been a long, stressful day, so I didn't think much of it, and was happy when they gave us permission to return to our cabins. The other guys seemed to be similarly worn out and sluggish. We all went back to our bunks and collapsed onto our bed. I fell asleep the moment my head hit the pillow. Huh? I pried open one eye and had to blink the room into focus. My head felt like it had been stuffed with cotton, making it hard to piece together thoughts. My arms were stretched uncomfortably towards the headboard, but when I tried to move them, cold metal bit in my wrists. I shifted, craning my neck to look up, and it took a long minute of staring to figure out exactly what was happening. A pair of handcuffs. Someone had cuffed me to my bed. I blinked dumbly, trying to process what this could mean in a mind still muddied with sleep. Around me, I heard similarly confused murmurs and the curious tugging of handcuffs. "What's going on, George?" I managed to remember his name from the day before, asked from the bed beside me. The murmurs became more frantic as reality had set in. All 6 of us were chained by our wrist to our bed, unable to move beyond a pathetic squirm. One of us started to scream, and then we all were. The door to our cabin burst open, and Ash, our counselor, rushed in. "What's the matter?" he said, looking between us with wide eyes. "Help us! Someone's cuffed us!" Instead of becoming more concerned at learning our plight, he relaxed, smiling. "Oh, ladies, it's okay. No need to panic. I did that." There was a collective demand to know why. "To start you on your journey to a healthier, happier you, you'll see, ladies, it's all part of the plan." Somehow, that didn't help. We shouted at him to unlock us, but he just stood there, shaking his head, his hands on his hips, smiling all the while. "Aw, listen to all of you. It's only day 1 and you're complaining already? Tisk tisk." It didn't take long for my arms to ache. I tried to sit up to help take some of the pressure off of them, but no position was comfortable. I wondered if any of the other cabins were experiencing similar treatment. I hadn't seen anyone walk by our window or heard any noises outside, so I assumed that was the case. Ash walked up and down between the beds, humming cheerfully, while he watched us struggle in our restraints. "I have to go to the bathroom," Matt said pleadingly. Ash paused beside his bed and crouched. "Okay, hon. Just go." "What?" "Go! Ash, please, it's an emergency." "No one's stopping you." I couldn't see Matt from where I was, but I could hear the desperation in his voice as he begged to be released. He started to cry, humiliated, and Ash shushed him for good nature. "It's okay, hon," he said. "You shouldn't be embarrassed. You already live in such a sickening lifestyle. Why is this any different?" His tone remained friendly, even sympathetic. "Pigs live in their own filth, Mr. Matthew." "What's wrong with you?" Jeff asked angrily. "You can't talk to him like that. You can't do this." Ash approached slowly and stood between our beds, smiling down at Jeff. "Oh, hon, I know that being reminded how yucky you are is hard, but we're in this together. Think of me as your shepherd and you, my little flock of fat piggies. I'm just doing what you're too weak to. And that's making sure you fat piggies stop shoveling food in those little pie holes of yours. Got that? This is kidnapping." "No need to be so dramatic, Jeff. Your parents signed waivers. Now, I'm going to go grab some breakfast, but I'll be back soon. You ladies have some fun, okay?" He left us in a stunned silence. Our parents had signed us up for this, knowing what it would entail. I wanted to cry, to be surprised that my own dad would do something like this, but all I felt was numb. Some of the other guys tried screaming again, but no one came, and so they cried instead. Tears were replaced by anger, and we all swore and made empty threats at the closed door. We tried to comfort one another as best as we could, discuss possibilities for escape, but it was only half-hearted, and eventually we all went quiet, lost in bitter thoughts. Hunger settled howling in my stomach, grumbling and groaning for relief. My mouth watered at the thought of everything I wanted, and I shook my handcuffs irritably. In the back of my mind, I could hear my dad's voice beating me for being so concerned with food at a time like this, and I was immediately flushed with guilt and shame. I shut my eyes, praying for some kind of relief. Ash didn't come back for many hours, and by then all of us were laying in our own waste. I was so embarrassed that I could barely bring myself to look at the other guys, much less Ash and his steady, sunny grin. Whew! It smells like a stee in here! Who wants a shower? I perked up slightly and saw that Jeff had done the same. We talked briefly about overpowering Ash and making a run in the moment he had freed us. Maybe this would be our chance. That hope was washed away when the first spray from Ash's hose, which I hadn't seen tucked discreetly behind his back. I gasped and sputtered under the wave of icy water that was spread liberally around the cabin, soaking all of us equally. There! Now don't we feel better? Ash chirped when he was through. Now, since we're all nice and clean, let's have some breakfast. My stomach roared in response and he laughed, turning to me. Well, 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 Mr. Nick. Your dad warned us about the appetite and now I can see what he meant. He clapped his hands together. Okay, piggies. Breakfast. Tim, bring it in. Another counselor came in wheeling a large garbage can. He beamed at us, and he and Ash each pulled on a pair of gloves and said, Hey ladies, I'm Tim. I'm part of the kitchen staff here. I just know you guys must be starved. I mean, have any of you had to go this long without eating before? Ash shook his head and laughed like it was one of the funniest jokes he's ever heard before. Have you seen these fat asses? Together, they moved the bin beside Jeff's bed and Ash reached in, pulling out a handful of what looked like a combination of yesterday's meals. Half-eaten burgers, bits of fish that I could already smell turning, wilted salad bits. Jeff shook his head when Ash held it up to his lips, his mouth clamped shut. Oh, this little piggy isn't hungry, Tim pouted. What do you think, Ash? Are any of them? Let's find out. One by one we were offered the food from the garbage and one by one we refused. I was confident they wouldn't let us starve. They couldn't, and I would not eat garbage. They didn't try to force us, just moved on when it was clear we wouldn't take any. They followed it up with fresh water, which they ladled from a bucket. I slurped greedily until Tim took it away, tisking me with an amused reproach. Wow, what a great first day, Ash said once they'd finished. You guys are already learning to listen to your bodies, eating only when you're truly hungry. I'm so proud. Okay, I want you all to really think about how much you accomplished today. Me and Tara are going to take your food back to the kitchen, but don't worry, we'll bring it back tomorrow. Waste not, want not, right? We all sat there together, famished, cold, wet, and really afraid. After the first couple of days, keeping track of time became really hard. We were left cuffed to our beds, sprayed down once a day, and offered the increasingly revolting garbage as our only source of food, along with a ladle full of water. I managed to hold out for a little while, but I was weak and I was hungry, and finally, I took a bite of what could only barely pass as a turkey burger. The smell of rotting meat made my already light head spin, and the taste made me gag, lingering on the back of my tongue as further punishment. I choked it down with tears in my eyes and drank the water that followed desperately, like it might help wash away the flavor and the memories too. Aw, so good, son, Ash said. Isn't it such a great feeling, eating only when you have to? Having that kind of self-control is so important. I'm proud of you, Mr. Nick. Jeff hadn't fared so well. When he tried to swallow the fish, which smelled like a hot dumpster, he retched then vomited frothy bile over the side of his bed and on the floor between us. Oh my god, look at what a little messy piggy you are, Mr. Jeff. Well, I guess you aren't very hungry today, are you? Jeff groaned and turned his face away from Ash. He had been so full of fight here in the beginning, but the longer we were held here, the more it fizzled out. We were no longer discussing escape plans or what we wanted to do to the camp staff once we were out of here. Talking required energy, and we were sorely lacking. Just trying to keep my thoughts coherent was becoming harder. My arms always ached, alternating between a cold numbness and a burning that made me wince whenever I shifted. I was sticky with old sweat and bodily waste, and the damp mattress beneath me stank of both. Insects, attracted by the stench, buzzed all around and every part of me itched beneath a layer of filth. I wanted to shed my skin, crawl out of it and burn it, certain it would never be truly clean again. We must have passed the first week or so like this, immobile and miserable. I began to think that maybe this would be the entirety of camp, and almost resigned myself to a full month and a half of doing nothing but wasting away my own excrement. You would be so proud, Dad. I thought during the night when I couldn't sleep, I haven't eaten in a while. I wanted to be angry, but feeling anything beyond the constant, gnawing hunger and hopelessness required too much effort. Rise and shine, my little piggies! Ash came sweeping into the cabin one morning, clapping his hands and shouting in a sing-song voice, Who wants to go for a swim? When Ash unlocked the cuffs and they fell away from my wrists, I thought I might have been dreaming. The blood rushing painfully back into my pale hands quickly dispelled that notion. I pushed myself to sit up, stiff and sore, and looked around at the other guys as they also rose. There was an air of hesitancy hanging over the room, as if we were waiting for the punchline of some joke Ash was thinking of. But he just stood in the doorway in his favorite pose with his hands on his hips, smiling. Always smiling. You guys sure have a funny way of showing your excitement. Come on, my little piggies, let's go. When no one moved from their bunks, he sighed and rolled his eyes theatrically. You guys don't want to go? I know having to get off your huge asses is a scary thing. I know exerting yourself more than unwrapping a candy bar is hard, but that's why you're here, to learn that being lazy is unacceptable. Last chance, piggies. Let's go! Underwhelmed by our continued reluctance, he reached down outside the door and picked something up. A long steel rod with a rubber grip handle. On the opposite end, which he displayed for clearly us to see, were 2 metal pins. You know what this is, ladies? He meandered between the beds, swinging the rod around casually. No? None of you? Silly piggies. I guess it's better to show than tell. He stopped at the foot of Alex's bed, and the guy cowered against his headboard. Alex is the largest of us, soft-spoken and gentle. I hadn't heard him speak much since the first day we arrived, only cry, but now he was babbling about how he'd go, how he'd love to swim, how he was sorry. Ash relaxed, nodded with a smoothing smile, and then pressed the rod against the center of Alex's chest. There was a sharp snap of electricity, and Alex yelped and fell back, his hands clutching at his chest. Oh, don't be dramatic, Mr. Alex. It's just a low-amp, low-voltage kettle. Well, piggy prod. Don't you feel more motivated? Alex sniffled and nodded once. Good! Then let's get that huge tub of lard body of yours out of the door and down to the lake. Come on, ladies! Alex was the first to get unsteadily to his feet, and then the rest of us followed. I gripped my headboard and pulled myself up, but found my legs shaky, bordering on unreliable. Dizziness threatened to knock me back down, but I was too afraid of Ash and his piggy prod to let that happen. With a great deal of concentration, I forced myself to put one foot in front of the other and fell in line with the rest. We were ushered, stumbling and blinking against the harsh sunlight, down towards the lake. Could I run for it? I wondered, looking over to the trees. They seemed so impossibly far and I felt so lethargic. Just walking was proving somewhat of a challenge. I couldn't even imagine how I'd managed to do anything more. Ash practically skipped along beside us, singing some camp song about having fun and making friends. At the lake's edge, we were met by 2 other counselors, Shane and Chaz, who waved enthusiastically and motioned for us to follow them down to a large dock and line up in front of them. Ash poked us along threateningly with his prod if he thought we were going too slow, but mercilessly let it off. Hi, ladies, Shane beamed at us. I am just so excited for you guys to be here. Oh my god, we've got such a fun activity planned for you. Yes, we do, Chaz jumped in. It's called whale watching. You want to know how we play? When we didn't answer, Ash shoved the prod under Matt's arm and pressed the trigger. Zap! Matt collapsed against me with a cry and we both almost fell backwards into the water. Shane waited until we had regained our balance before continuing. Okay, so here's how it works. You guys, the whales, are going to get in the water and tread, tread, tread. We're the watchers. We're going to sit up here on the dock and, you guessed it, watch. But here's the fun part, Chaz said. The first person that gets tired and needs to be pulled out of the water gets 5 pokes from Ash's piggy prod. Every person after that will get 1 less until there's only 1 of you left in the water. The person won't get the prod, they'll get a nice fresh bowl of salad instead. Doesn't that sound like fun? The 3 counselors cheered enthusiastically and directed us to turn and face the water. I remember how thinking pretty it was at the beginning. Now, this looked devastating. I was half convinced I was going to drown in it. We were shoved in with the shouts of encouragement trailing behind us. The water was so cold and deep and sent a shock throughout my system. Ash and the others sat on the side of the dock, their legs dangling over the side. Occasionally, they'd kick up water at us, laughing all the while. Don't slow down, Dan. You won't get rid of your blubber by just floating there. You're a whale, not a log. Keep kicking. Aw, look at my little piggies. Paddle, paddle, paddle. I'm so proud of you. It didn't take long for my lungs to start burning from exertion. My arms and legs felt heavy, even submerged, and it took every ounce of strength to keep them moving. The fatigue I'd felt before was becoming thicker, a blanket of weariness that threatened to drag me under. Beside me, Jeff's treading started to turn into more of flailing, and I saw his head start to go dangerously low. He went under once, pulled himself back up, but then was down again. He was gasping for breath, coughing, and his splashing was becoming more panicked. I heard him shout for help before going underneath again. I wanted to go help him, but the warning that a drowning person will pull you under with him echoed loudly in my ears. "Help him!" Dan shrieked, which had a ripple effect, and we all started screaming for them to do something. After a minute of listening us call for help, Shane stood up and lazily sauntered to the pole where the rescue ring was hanging and unhooked it. "You sure you want this, Jeff? If you give up now, that's 5 pokes. "Someone's got to be first," Ash said, pointing the prod down at Jeff. "Throw him the ring." "Alrighty then." The ring landed with a flat splash beside Jeff. He grabbed at it and pulled it close, clinging to it with desperate fear. The whole time the counselors hauled him in by the ring's rope, he stared back at us, pale and shivering. After he'd been pulled to the shore, Ash toweled him off and led him down to the dock so he was standing in front of us. "Wasn't that pathetic, piggies? Barely 30 minutes and already Jeff's let himself give up. I bet if the prize had been a double cheeseburger, he would have lasted longer." While the counselors laughed, Jeff's lip trembled. I recognized the shame, born so nakedly on his face, and I could feel his hurt. While we continued to tread water before them, they berated him and called him names, each one punctuated by the prod. When they were finished, Jeff sank to his knees and buried his hands in his face. "We aren't doing this because we want to hurt you," Ash said, patting Jeff on the back. "We're giving you tough love so that you can be your happiest, healthiest self. Underneath all the rolls and stretch marks, there are beautiful men just waiting to be set free." "We were all like you once," Shane added sympathetically. "We understand that changing isn't easy, especially when you're allowed to become such an ugly, unhealthy cow, but we're going to help you, just like we were helped." They let Jeff move to the end of the dock, where he would sit alone and cry while they resumed their whale watching. Alex was pulled out next, and then Dan, and then Matt. Each time, they were given the same treatment as Jeff had been given. The counselors seemed to get even more delight in it. The prods were less in number, but more in duration, and when Matt's punishment was complete, I was sure I could smell the burning flesh. With only 2 of us left, Ash crouched and clapped. "I'm so proud of you, Mr. Nick. You too, Mr. Evan. You sure are showing these other hand beasts how it's done." Evan and I exchanged worried glances. The only thing that had kept me going was the threat of that prod, but even that was starting to not be enough. The water felt thick, harder to push through, and my arms especially screamed at me to stop. I could feel the lake trying to suck me down. I knew it wouldn't be much longer before I would go under. The first time my head went under, I managed to resurface quickly, but when I went down again, it was much more difficult to find my way back up. I clawed at the water, grabbing at it like I would find something to take hold of. Evan had noticed this and put some distance between us when he noticed I was starting to struggle, but I could hear him calling to me, telling me to keep going, but I couldn't. Just as I felt the very last ounce of strength slipping away, the ring landed in front of me. I didn't want to grab it. I didn't want to go back to shore, to Ash and his piggy prod, but what choice did I have? I slung an exhausted arm around the ring and let them drag me in. They were chatty when they dragged me off, telling me they were amazed that someone so fat could last so long on the water. "It must be a hippo instead of a pig," Shane said, and they all laughed. Just as the others had been, I was brought down to the dock and made to stand in front of Evan, who was still managing to stay afloat, although I could tell it was almost killing him to do so. "Mr. Nick, you did so good. 1 hour and 24 minutes. I can't believe it. Of course, to a normal person, that's not so long. But, for someone like you, wow." Ash gushed from over my shoulder. "But, unfortunately, you were only in 2nd place. You know what that means." I didn't even have time to shudder. He just stuck the prod against my back and pressed down on the trigger. Every muscle in my body tightened at once, and I couldn't move. I was trapped in my own body, locked into place by Ash and his prod, unable to speak or even think. He held me there until it started to burn. When he yanked it away, I just crawled back to the dock. Evan was helped ashore and dried off, and they made a big show of presenting him with a big bowl of fresh salad, which had been brought down by Tim. The sight of the round, red cherry tomatoes and crisp lettuce was enough to have my mouth watering. I had never wanted anything so much more than I wanted that salad. The others crowded closer, our eyes transfixed in longing. Evan hugged the bowl against his stomach and raised the fork to his mouth. Evan got one bite of the salad before Ash knocked the bowl from his hands and knocked it into the lake. "I want you to savor that bite, Evan. Remember how nice and cool it was. Vegetables should be your favorite food. And when you're hungry tonight, think about that salad. How good it was. How much you wanted to finish it. Let yourself crave in. Soon, you won't ever find yourself wanting greasy chips or fatty sweets anymore. You'll want that salad. Great job, ladies. Now let's get you back to your bunks for some rest." Ash, Shane, and Chaz herded us back to the cabin, pushing us to go quickly despite how tired we were. If I had thought it was hard to run earlier, it now became impossible. Every nerve still tingled uncomfortably from the prod. My arms drooped uselessly. My legs barely wanted to carry me anymore. My head buzzed with hunger and thirst and the need for good, solid sleep. None of us argued as we were returning to our beds, the mattresses of which had been flipped over and handcuffed back into place. We were too exhausted. Ash smiled from the door, his hand on the light switch. Get some rest, my little piggies. Tomorrow, we learn to let go of dead weight. After such ominous parting words, I was sure I wouldn't be able to sleep. Let go of dead weight? I pictured dull, rusty knives and Ash's sugary sweet voice telling us we only had minutes to cut it off before he would sick a pack of dogs on us to get the rest. Even with images of blood and screaming filling my head, the threat of whatever tomorrow might bring wasn't enough to overcome the sheer exhaustion which enveloped me. I drifted in and out of sleep for hours, sometimes waking from the pitiful whine of my stomach, sometimes from the depths of a watery nightmare, sometimes just from the pain. Everything hurt. I felt strained, stretched thin, and sore. My head throbbed, leaving me clouded and dizzy, and I wondered over and over again how much more I could take. In a half-dream state, my thoughts wandered to my father. Had he really known what they were doing to us? Had he really willingly signed away my safety and well-being in hopes I'd lose weight? Surely, no father would prefer seeing his son starve, possibly die, instead of being fat. Then again, this was the same father who would only admit I was his child if asked directly. Otherwise, I was just Nick, the afterthought, only introduced out of necessity. I almost wanted to laugh, or maybe I wanted to cry. I really just wasn't sure. Were the other boys here from similar homes? We hadn't really had a chance to talk much about our lives outside of camp, much less our relationships with our families, but no sane parent would have sent their son here. While I had known there had to be other dads out there like mine, I thought they were few and far between. The number of boys I'd seen at camp that first night, it must have been 50 or 60, made me rethink that. I watched the room go from black to gray and then light up with the cracks of sunlight that snuck around the drawn curtains around the door. Evan started to cry when he woke up and saw morning had come already. We knew what it meant, and it terrified us. As if drawn in by the tears, the cabin door flung open and Ash strode in all pep and good cheer. "Good morning, little piggies," he sang, stretching his arms over his head and inhaling deeply. "You gals sure know how to stink up a place, don't you? But that's okay. That is okay. We will deal with that later. For now, though, we have other things planned." He rubbed his hands together and looked around, excitement shining in his eyes. There was a collective nervousness shifting of bed springs and cuffs as he walked down the row of beds, inspecting us, visually dissecting us. "You little piggies hungry?" he asked once he had looked us over. We lay in tense silence, unwilling to answer. After the garbage and the trick with the salad, we didn't expect anything from him. At least, not anything good. "I asked you a question, ladies," he chirped, his hands on his hips. "I expect an answer. One more time. Who is hungry?" The non-committal groaning and mumbling he received seemed to have been good enough for him, because he waved out the cabin door and Tim came in carrying a covered tray. "Mr. Tim whipped up something extra special this morning to help you get prepared and ready for your activity today. Well, who wants first dibs?" When no one answered, he turned to Alex. "You're the fattest little piggy here. I bet you're just dying to dive in, huh? Okay, come on, Tim, let's get him some breakfast. But be careful, don't want this one gnawing off your hand." They snickered together and set the tray on the bed beside Alex. I don't think any of us breathed while we waited to see what fresh torture they conceived this time. The lid was removed and Alex's eyes went wide. Sitting in the very center of the tray, still steaming, was a half-full bowl of plain oatmeal. Ash plucked up the spoon that Tim had brought and filled it full of the oatmeal. "What do you think, Mr. Alex? Want some yummy food?" Ash held the spoon in front of Alex's face, waving it back and forth. Alex nodded once, his chin quivering. Ravenous hunger burned feverishly bright in his eyes, which never left the spoon. Ash laughed, delighted, and fed Alex the bite of oatmeal. Tears streamed openly down Alex's round cheeks, and he held it in his mouth, savoring the first real food he'd had in over a week. The rest of us had all unconsciously leaned forward, licking and chewing our lips, trying to at least get a whiff of the oatmeal over the dank cabin air. "Okay, little piggy, before you get too carried away, you need to make a choice." There it was, the catch. I had known it was too good to be true, but it still raked like ice down my spine. We all tensed, waiting for Ashley's terms. "Now, you can have this whole bowl all to yourself, every last bite. Or, you can take one more spoonful and pass it down to the guy next to you." The room went silent. Alex's mouth had fallen open as he looked at us. There was a war going on inside of his head, and we all silently begged that he let the right side win and pass the bowl along. Our empty stomachs rumbled, voicing our hunger for us when we dared not to. "Pass," he said quietly and hung his head. Oh my god. How generous is he, guys? I mean, wow. That is some self-control right there. I am just, wow, so proud, Ash said, and Tim nodded enthusiastically along in agreement. They fed Alex one more bite and moved to Dan, who had thin lines of drool dibbling down his chin at the sight of the oatmeal. He opened wide and was given his first bite and then the same choice. Keep it or pass the bowl. Dan didn't hesitate. More, he pleaded. Give me more. Are you sure? Ash asked. You don't want to share with the other little piggies? I wasn't certain Dan had even heard him. He struggled against his restraints, trying to get his hands on that spoon. We shouted at him, no words, just unintelligible, starved anger. He shook his head like it would help block us out and kept shouting, louder and louder, for more. With every spoonful he got, my resentment deepened. It was only plain oatmeal, something I'd never even liked, but watching that bowl become emptier and emptier was like watching a lifeline fade away. I hated Dan in that moment, but there was also some part of me, a tiny whisper I barely acknowledged, that was grateful. Because of him, I'd never have to find out if I would have been strong enough to share that bowl. Well, Mr. Dan, Ash said after the oatmeal was completely finished, I can't say that I'm not disappointed. Alex, so fat he's barely even human-shaped anymore, was able to share. But you were a greedy little piggy, weren't you? Dan turned away, his eyes downcast. It's okay though, this was very helpful. Now that all the other little piggies have seen how selfish and disgusting you are, they know what they look like every time they gorge themselves. It's gross, huh guys? Ash motioned for Tim to clear away the rest of the tray, and once it was gone, he stood in the center of the room. Well, now that that's done, on to today's activity. As he'd done the day before, he retrieved his piggy prod and uncuffed us so that we could line up and leave the cabin. Dan made sure to stay at the back of the line by Ash to avoid our reproachful glares, but more than once I looked over my shoulder, so that he was forced to see my anger. Ash told me that no one liked a stink face. Again, I considered running, but even if I had tried, how far would I get? Hungry, tired, in pain from overexertion, unable to think straight for more than short bursts, and, as Ash kept pointing out, extremely out of shape. There was no escape. The others might have realized the same thing because we trudged, silent and single file, towards the tree line, where I could see Sean and other counselors waiting. Ladies, Ash said after we'd stopped in front of them, I'd like you to meet one of our activity coordinators, Carl. He helps whip up all the fun activities we get to do around here. Say hi! There was a soft murmur of grudging hellos, and Carl waved with both hands, grinning. So, Carl, you want to tell my little piggies what we'll be doing today? I would love to, but first, how'd breakfast go? Well, not so great actually. Mr. Alex, bless his little heart, was quick to share, but then Mr. Dan gobbled all the rest up and left nothing for anyone else. That's not so great at all, Carl said, but that's okay. Mistakes are made, and that's how we learn. But only if there are consequences. We all looked over at Dan. I didn't do anything wrong, he said desperately. You're starving us! I couldn't help myself! I was so hungry! Dan lost control of himself. He broke down into heavy sobs that shook throughout his whole body. Ah, son! Shh! Shh! Ash put an arm around Dan's shoulders and gave him a squeeze. It's okay! You're weak! We know! We're working on fixing that. We certainly are, Carl said, and today's activity was planned with that very goal in mind. Today, our focus is going to be on learning to let go of dead weight. Doesn't that sound fun? Dan, why don't you come here and we'll get you kitted out so the others can see what we'll be doing today. Dan shook his head and tried to back up, but a poke from the piggy prod had him jumping forward. Carl and Shane grabbed his arms and hauled him front and center. Now guys, today we're going to take a rope. Carl held the length of the course rope and tied it around Dan's waist, and tied it around each of you, like so. We are then going to knot the free end to the next guy in line. So, you, what's your name? This is Nick, Ash answered for me. Okay, Nick, come here. That's it. He wrapped the rope around me like a belt and tightened it uncomfortably before tying me to Dan. Down the line he went, until we were all strung together. Okay, now that we're in our little chain gang, we're ready to accessorize. Sean? Sean knelt and picked up a box that I hadn't noticed sitting beside him. He opened the top and held it out so we could see the contents. Little black boxes with straps. Ankle bracelets, he said, giving the box a little shake. Tracking ankle bracelets, Carl corrected him. You're each going to wear one so we can keep an eye on you. They're waterproof, and if you try to remove them, they'll tattle on you and we'll know. Don't need any sneaky piggies in my flock, Ash said as Carl strapped a bracelet on each of us. And now, one more thing just for Dan. Carl rooted around in the box and came up with a pair of wrist weights. These are each 10 pounds. They represent the weight you're no doubt going to gain if you keep eating like the little fat pig you are. Aren't those heavy? Ugh, fat is such a drag, huh? Dan let his weighted arms fall to his sides with a whimper. So, who wants to find out what all this is for? Ooh, I do, Ash cheered. Great, it's very simple. All you guys have to do he paused for dramatic effect, is run. Not so easy when you're all tied together though, huh? Someone's bound to get tired. Slow everyone else down, right? Not to worry, just let that dead weight go. You can untie the knot and you'll be free to keep moving. If you don't want to leave the dead weight, we're more than happy to give you a little encouragement. And the guy who's left behind in the woods will be picked up by a counselor. There's a few spread out in the woods, so don't worry. He won't be alone for too long, Sean said. The last one still running will get a nice bath after and another bowl of oatmeal. Doesn't that sound great? Carl folded his arms over his chest, clearly pleased. Just make sure you stick to the trails. Piggies who wander off will be punished. Okay guys, ready, set, run! None of us could run, even if we had the energy. Being tied together made it awkward and uncomfortable, so we were forced to shuffle off in a wadding power walk into the woods. It wasn't long before the huffing and puffing started. Even if we wanted to try and plan an escape, we wouldn't have been able to speak through our wheezing. The muscles in my legs cramped and seized, forcing me to slow, but I couldn't stop. I had to ignore the sound of blood rushing in my ears, ignore the weight of fatigue that played in every step, ignore the pounding in my head. I could feel the sluggishness of the girls around pulling at the rope, but I had to keep moving. When Dan started to lag, I knew it was the beginning of the end. Don't leave me. He kept whispering breathlessly, but the rope was taut and he could barely lift himself anymore. The additional weight had taken its toll. Matt made the final decision to untie him, but none of us had tried to stop him. I thought I'd feel some kind of vengeful glee at leaving Dan behind, but seeing his crumpled up body in the middle of the path, calling weakly after us, I could only feel pity. We kept marching forward, even after the shrieks had started, and we were sure counselors had found him. Evan fell next, face down and sobbing, and when we tried to get him back on his feet, a counselor appeared on the edge of the path, with a similar rod in his hand. He waved it warningly at us, and we were forced to leave Evan behind. I wanted to be strong. I wanted to prove Ash wrong. I wanted to walk until my feet fell off just to show him that I could withstand whatever he threw at me. But what I wanted, and what I was capable of, were two different things. I stumbled and grabbed at Alex, trying to keep myself upright, but he shook me off, unable to bear my weight along with his own. Please, help! I begged pathetically. Instead, Alex undid my knot, freeing the remaining three from me. He looked at me, his expression haunted, and said, I'm sorry. I watched their backs as they continued to move on without me. I'm not stopping, I wheezed. I'm not stopping. I made it a few small steps before I was prodded in the back and sent staggering to the ground. No, no, little piggy. It was Carl. You were deemed dead weight, and dead weight does not get to keep moving. Ash, Sean, we got another one down. Together, they stripped me down to my underwear, leaving the ankle bracelet attached, and dragged me to a thick tree. I was tied tightly to the trunk, so that its bark bit painfully into my bare flesh every time I tried to move. Once I was secure, they each took a turn using the piggy prod on me. Since dead weight gets left behind, you get to sleep in the woods tonight. Ash crouched in front of me. I want you to really think about that lazy life of luxury you've been living while you're out here. All that comfort, how easy you had it, it's made you the little piggy you are today. You need to learn to toughen up, and this exercise, well, that'll help you do just that. Okay guys, let's go see if we've got any more dead weight to deal with. They linked arms and walked away, leaving me alone, mostly nude and tied to a tree in the middle of the woods. I struggled feebly, uselessly, against the ropes, but all it did was make the tree's bark dig deeper into my naked back. Every time I shifted, I was certain that I could feel my skin thinning, threatening to split. It didn't take long for the insects to find me and feast on my exposed flesh, leaving a trail of angry red welts in their wake. Sometimes it felt like they were burrowing into my skin, crawling beneath it, eating me from the inside out. Thirst burned in my throat, hunger echoed in my empty stomach, and I itched and I ached and I could find no relief. Somewhere nearby, up the trail and out of sight, I could hear one of the guys, maybe Jeff, screaming. He was begging for help, for someone to find him, and I almost shouted for him to shut up. No one was coming. I had realized that. Why hadn't he? I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block out the noise, and leaned my head back against the tree. The hours passed slowly. The only way I could be sure time was even moving at all was by the lengthening of the shadows and the eventual darkness that creeped into the woods. Usually, I would have been terrified at the idea of being alone outside in nightfall, and my imagination would have run wild, turning every bush into some kind of monster, just waiting to pounce. But now, there was no room for any more fear, no energy to conjure up my make-believe beasts. I couldn't even bring myself to cry. There was no sleep to be had, only a foggy daze, and after Jeff, or whoever had been, when quiet and silence had blanketed the woods, voices started to ring in my ears, soft at first, but growing louder, angrier. My dad, Ash, Tim, Carl. Little piggy, disgusting, fat, lazy, weak. The chorus went on and on, bouncing through my mind until it was all I heard. I couldn't fight them off, couldn't make them stop. Round and round they went, until I was sick and dizzy with grief, guilt, and self-hatred. I was all of those things. I was. If I hadn't been stronger, better, this wouldn't have happened. I didn't realize I'd started hitting the back of my head against the tree until the voices shattered, broken by the heavy crack of my skull against the wood. I forced myself to stop, wrenching my head from side to side and breathing hard. I'm losing it, I whispered, and I laughed softly, bitterly, through the few tears that still managed to slip out. I thought earlier that I could get through it, that I could prove them all wrong and overcome anything. I knew now how wrong I had been. How many days had it been since I'd eaten real food? How long since I'd actually slept, or showered, or done anything even remotely human? It couldn't have been much longer than a week and a half, but it weighed on me like an eternity. To keep the voices at bay, I tried to think of a song, any song, but I couldn't make sense of any of the jumbled lyrics that tried to surface. I started to hum, tunelessly instead, just a steady hum, a stream of noise to fill up the spaces in my head. Nick? I looked around sharply, only half sure I'd actually heard my name. Nick! There it was again, coming from somewhere just opposite of me. I leaned as far forward as the rope allowed, which wasn't much, and narrowed my eyes, trying to see through the darkness. A shadow separated from the tree, short and round, and skittered around me. It's me, Matt hissed as he dropped to his knees beside me. I got away from Ash on our way back to camp and came back for you. I'll untie you and then we can get out of here. I just stared at him dumbly. Just stay quiet. I know they're looking for me. He was working hard on the knot. I could feel him tugging on it, and then the rope started to loosen. He came back around, one loose end in his hands. Come on, he said anxiously. We have to go. I started to push myself up on my legs that had long since fallen asleep, but there was something in the way he kept looking over his shoulder that had me pause. Somewhere in my brain, alarm bells were going off. I froze, a mouse who had caught wind of a cat. Come on, Matt urged again. I wanted to believe him, but something in me, something primal, unthinking part that worked only off of instinct, kept me in place. My mind was a mudslide, a mess of half-formed ideas and questions that I couldn't begin to put into words. I wanted to believe him, but I didn't. Nick! He was almost crying, desperate, and still looking over his shoulder. No. That was all I managed to say. He tried pulling on my arms, but I went limp and let myself sink back against the tree. He cursed at me and pulled again, but it was no use. I wasn't going to budge. Why? Just come on. I shook my head. Please, Nick! When it became clear to him that I wasn't moving, he screamed at me, telling me that this was the only chance I had and it was just stupid to sit there. Insults, cursing, and through all of it, I remained motionless. My half-opened eyes gazed on the tree line just behind him. The tirade was allowed to go on for another minute or so before I heard it telling zap, and Matt was forced to take a knee. What a good, obedient little piggy, Ash cooned, his piggy poker slung easily over one shoulder. I thought for sure you'd be off running, or waddling, but here you are. I'm just so gosh damn proud. You've learned some serious self-control. Matt shook with sobs and Ash patted him on the head. Mr. Matt here was the winner of today's activity, but the little piggy still hadn't had his oatmeal. We had a surprise part 2 that he hadn't learned about yet, and, well, surprise, wasn't it great? It took me a long minute to make sense of his words. A part 2, tricking us into trying to leave? I gazed blankly at them, still trying to fit all the pieces together. Ash noticed my struggle and said kindly, Don't you worry your little fat head about it, Mr. Nick. We'll explain everything back at camp. Now come on, get up. We've got a bit of a walking to do. I stumbled down the path alongside Matt, the threat of Ash's prod looming constantly from behind. I didn't feel any sense of betrayal, no anger, no upset with Morgan. I was too numb to anything other than exhaustion. We were guided back to the cabin where all the other guys were already gathered and recuffed to the beds. I had never thought I'd actually feel any measure of joy being returned to that stinking, stained bunk, but after so many hours spending against a tree, I welcomed it. Ash brought me a ladle full of water, which I sucked down greedily and gave my cheek a little pinch. Most of you are just so well behaved, little piggies, he said, waving the now empty ladle across the room. Only one of you, his eyes flicked to Evan, who shrank further against his pillow, was very, very naughty. He tossed the ladle to the floor and crawled over to Evan. I'm sorry, Evan kept repeating, but Ash acted like he didn't hear it. Do you know what will hold you back, make it impossible for you to be healthier, happier you? Ash asked. Running away from your problems. You will never learn how to cope without resorting to food if you just keep trying to run away. It's the easy thing to do, and we all know that your fat asses are out there thinking about it all the time. But not here, my little piggies. I won't let you. Today's activity was about learning to let go of your dead weight and then taking responsibility for your weakness. Mr. Matt did so good, he ran and ran while the rest of you let your fat drag you down. And you had some time to think about that, and all the bad decisions you made out here while you were tied to those trees. We asked Mr. Matt to go back out there and offer you an easy way out, the kind you've always taken. Matt couldn't meet any of the glances that were shot his way. Shame clouded his expression, made it impossible to face us. While most of you tried to keep the lessons you've learned close to your overworked little hearts, Mr. Evan here was naughty. Can you believe he tried to run away after all the help we've given him? Given all of you? I must say, I'm really disappointed. But I can forgive you all, my little piggies. I can and I will, because we all make mistakes. Evan tried to look hopeful. He even tried to squeeze a smile in when Ash gave his shoulder a squeeze. But remember, Ash said sweetly, in order to earn that forgiveness, you must face the consequences. Evan's smile faded into confusion and then into a terrified, pleading frown. He tugged at his restraints, begging Ash to give him a second chance, to let him prove that he was good, just like the rest of us. Ash crouched beside him and smoothed Evan's hair away from his face, shushing him gently. Your whole life has been spent with people going easy on you, and that's why you look like the way you do, like a cookie dough. It's time for some tough love, hon. Tim, come on in. The cabin door swung open and Tim entered, one of the large metal serving trays in his hands. Its cover was in its place, hiding its contents. He brought it over to Ash, and with a dramatic flourish, removed the lid. Great, Matt's bowl of oatmeal is here. Leave the tray with me and I'll bring that over to our little winner. Tim scooped the bowl of oatmeal up, and left the tray in Ash's hands to go and spoon-feed Matt, who at least tried to act hesitant about accepting. He ate it while we all watched, envious with stomachs growling. With that taken care of, Ash's attention turned fully to Evan, and when Evan started to scream, "No! No!" we took our eyes off of Matt and followed suit. Ash held the tray aloft, panning it slowly around the room so that we could all see the hammer lying upon it. My stomach turned sour, and I felt the blood drain from my face. Do you know what happens to naughty piggies who try to escape? Ash said. They have to be hobbled. The hammer was in his hand. Evan was shrieking, begging him not to. The rest of us raised our voices as well. All of our screaming, all of our shouting, and all of our crying. It meant nothing. I think we all heard the sound of metal hitting flesh. Four times Ash swung with the hammer, and each time, Evan became more shrill. Pain contorted his features, bulging his eyes, twisting his hands in their cuffs. I wanted to vomit, but there was nothing in my stomach to purge. You see my little pigs? Ash asked, his face flushed. This is what happens when you're naughty. You must be punished. It's the only way you'll ever learn. You've been coddled your whole lives, allowed to become huge and unhealthy and ugly. The first chance you get, you run right back to whatever's easy, which just starts the cycle over again. You're never going to improve if this is how you're going to live your life. Evan was rolling his head back and forth, uncontrollably in pain. Fat beads of sweat popped up on his forehead and dripped down his face, mingling in with his tears. Ash tweaked his cheek and stood up. Okay, gentlemen, I feel like we've made some real progress, but now it's time for some rest. So lights out, eyes shut, and try to dream of something other than food. On their way out the door, I overheard Tim say, That reminds me of that Stephen King book, the one with the author and the crazy lady. Ash giggled. Where do you think Carl got the idea? There was no comforting Evan that night, although we tried what little we could. We talked to him in soothing tones, tried to distract him with stories, disjointed and poorly thought out as they were, told him what we would do to Ash on his behalf. But Evan just kept groaning through all of it, absorbed so completely in pain that I don't think he even knew we were talking to him. We gave up after a while, one by one going quiet, until the cabin was filled only by the sounds of Evan's misery. His low, animalistic wails lasted throughout the night and into morning, when Ash returned to hose us down. He frowned down at Evan from the foot of his bed and gave him an extra spray in the face. No need to be such a drama queen, Mr. Evan, he chastised him. You deserve this. After he'd finished dousing us with the hose, he coiled up the hose and stood in the door with a sparkling smile. You guys are going to be so thrilled for our next activity. We have to wait for it to rain, but that should happen any day now. As soon as it does, we are back outside and learning how to really appreciate the hard work that goes into putting food on the table. Until then, enjoy a few days with your feet up. I know it's what my little piggies like best. He giggled, wiggled his fingers at us, and let the door shut behind him. They took Evan away a few days later. A woman introduced as Nurse Bianca swept in, made a show of examining Evan's swollen, purple ankle, then had Ash and Carl help move him into a wheelchair. Evan winced in pain and was limp in their arms, his eyes rolling and glassy. "He's gonna be just fine," Nurse Bianca assured us on their way out. "A few days in the infirmary, and he'll be right back out here with all of you." But she never came back, and the longer she was gone, the more restless the rest of us had become. We whispered our theories in the dead of night, that Evan had been left somewhere for someone else to find, that he'd been chained up and left to suffer alone, where we couldn't see, and worst, we thought he'd been killed. "Any one of us could be next," Jeff said one night. After witnessing the depths the counselors were willing to go, something in Jeff had snapped. He was moody, withdrawn, angry, and obsessed with the idea that it was only a matter of time before we all shared Evan's fate, or worse. And to be honest, I didn't disagree with him. "But I follow the rules here," Dan squeaked. "So? They'll change the rules. Don't be stupid. They don't want us to exceed. They want us to break." Alex started to sob quietly in the dark. He didn't do else much lately, and I understood his fears. I shared them too, and I wanted to cry, but it didn't help. I just stayed quiet, sagging against my handcuffs. "How long have we been here?" Jeff asked. 2 weeks. A little over, Matt said uncertainly. Time was hard to keep track of, harder still when the lack of food and lack of sleep made our thoughts slippery and hard to hold on to. "We're not even halfway done." Jeff trailed off, and the room settled into an uneasy silence. A month left. A month of activities and insults and starvation. A month with a group of psychopaths hell-bent on torturing the fat out of us. I couldn't do it. I knew I couldn't. I was already so weak, in so much pain. The thought of being made to endure even more made me tremble. The day the rain came, all eyes were fixed on the door. The air was tense, stifling, and I felt like a heavy weight was sitting on my chest, making it hard to breathe. Every snap of a twig outside the cabin had my heart racing. Every gust of wind that shook the door made me shrink against my stained pillow. Certain Ash had come for us. The longer we had to wait, the more anxious I had become. But it wasn't until the rain had died down and the clouds parted that Ash and Carl appeared, all smiles in their bright coats and boots. "Who's ready for our next activity?" Carl asked. His hands were clasped together in anticipation. Ash held up a large metal pail, bent and rusted from years of use, in one hand. "Any guesses on what it could be? Anyone?" I pressed my cracked lips into a thin line to keep my chin from quivering. Whatever they had prepared for us was no doubt degrading, exhausting, and I don't know where I was going to find the strength to muster to complete it. My limbs felt like lead. Just picking them up was becoming a challenge, and any movement sent ripples of sharp pain through my head, blurring my vision and leaving me reeling. If I couldn't do it, if I was too slow or too feeble, what would they do to me? My eyes feasted upon their piggy prods, always in hand, and I swallowed hard. "No one wants to guess?" Carl pouted theatrically. "Well, fine, lazy piggies. We're going hunting. For you to really appreciate your dinner, you're gonna have to catch it. But don't worry, don't you worry. We know it would be too hard for you to actually catch something that's capable of walking. So we're keeping it simple. Worms. Little piggies just love rolling around in the mud, so this should be extra fun, huh? I know my little piggies are looking forward to a big dinner, so I'm sure they'll catch lots. Come on, up, up, up!" The handcuffs fell away and Ash used the end of her prod to poke me out of bed. I kept waiting for the snap of electricity to vibrate through my body, but it never came. I fell in line behind Matt, relieved. "What's wrong, little piggy?" Carl was standing over Jeff's bed, looking down at him. Jeff had sat up, but he was hunched over, his face buried in his hands. Miserable sobs whacked throughout his shoulders, and he was gasping for air, almost hyperventilating. Carl traded an eye roll with Ash and crouched, resting his free hand on his knee. Okay, shh, it's okay," he said tenderly. "You can cry all you want, but you know what? That won't make you any less fat. So get your fat ass up and get in line, okay?" The roar that followed from Jeff's mouth had us falling back, away from the pair. As soon as the sound had left his lips, Jeff had thrown his body against Carl's, his hands tearing at the coordinator's face. His nails, blackened by dirt and grime, raked down the pale skin, and they both fell back against the wall. The piggy prod was dropped in shock and rolled underneath the bed. There was a brief scuffle and they were both on the floor, Jeff using his weight to keep Carl pinned beneath him. Carl flailed, his hand shoving at Jeff, and he shrieked for Ash to come help him. Ash shook off the initial surprise and charged forward. Piggy prod raised, pointed at Jeff. I was rooted to the spot, my mouth dry, trembling. They were going to be mad. Were we going to be punished? What was Jeff thinking? My mind was a web of terror, catching and encasing all else. I clutched the footboard behind me, shaking my head as if to deny I had any part of this. Alex lurched forward, his eyes wide, mouth open, bellowing, and he grabbed at Ash from behind. Ash brought his elbow back sharply once, twice, and then tried to bring him around the prod. but Alex threw his head hard against the end of a bed, doubling him over and yanked his head back by his eyeballs. He pulled hard until Ash was screaming at the top of his lungs, and his grip had loosened. He yanked the prod from Ash's hand and threw it out of his reach. When Ash turned his neck around, looking over his shoulder for help, I saw, for the first time, fear in his eyes. Carl had managed to wiggle halfway out from underneath Jeff and headbutt him sharp across the nose. Jeff yelled, stunned, and Carl, clearly also dazed, flopped on his stomach and started to scramble across the floor, towards the bed towards his prod. He had managed to outstretch his hand, reaching desperately, when Matt's foot came slamming down on it. Again and again he stomped until Carl withdrew it and flung himself backwards, his hand cradled against his chest. Jeff was on him again, one arm wrapped around his throat, his free hand punching wildly at Carl's face. Carl tried to ward off the blows, but Jeff shook him viciously, compressing his neck. Ash was crushed beneath the footboard in Alex's girth, his face shoved down into the mattress and its filth. Every time he tried to push himself up, Alex delivered a harsh blow to his side. Carl saw Ash's prod was close to him, and, with a strangled yell, managed to sink his teeth into Jeff's arm. Reflexively, Jeff pushed back just slightly, enough for Carl to drive his shoulder into his chest, and then Carl was diving forward. Carl reared back, his expression belligerent, disbelieving, and pained. Blood had started to fall in a small trickle down the side of his face from the gash by the piggy prod. Matt stood over him, his eyes bright and feverish with fury, and swung Ash's prod again. Carl crumpled to the floor. Jeff and I had huddled together, watching the horror, our mouths hanging open. It didn't seem real. It couldn't be real. Jeff hauled himself to his feet, his breathing ragged. He swayed himself unsteadily. "What did you do?" Dan whispered, his eyes fixed on Carl's unmoving body. "I'm getting out of here," Jeff said. "Come on, help me get him into the bed." "Is he dead?" I dared to ask. "No, unfortunately. I can still see him breathing." Jeff waved impatiently at us. "Matt, Nick, come on." I tore myself away from Dan's side, and mechanically, barely aware of what I was doing, I grabbed one of Carl's arms, and we dragged him over to Jeff's bed. I can honestly say, the handcuffs clicking into place around his wrists was one of the most satisfying sounds I've ever heard. "Now what do we do with Ash?" Alex asked anxiously. Now that the excitement had died down and the initial rush had worn off, he was starting to struggle to keep Ash down. Ash's cheeks were wet with tears when we wrenched him up. He was a babbling, blubbering mess, trying to justify his actions, telling us everything he'd done was for our own good. Jeff put a stop to that by yanking off his sock and shoving it in his mouth. Dan kept apologizing to him while the rest of us cuffed up his wrists and put him to the headboard. "I followed the rules. I was good. I'm so sorry. They made me." "Shut the hell up, Dan, okay?" Jeff snapped. "They're gonna find us. The rest of them. They're gonna find us and punish us." Jeff reared back and delivered a resounding slap to Dan's face. "Shut the fuck up, or we're leaving you." "Do it. Then they'll know. Then they'll know I was good. It wasn't my idea." Dan, unfazed, leapt eagerly back into the bed and looked at the rest of us unexpectedly, his arms held toward the handcuffs. "What now?" Matt asked after we locked Dan back in place. His face drawn and pale, he looked out the window, across campgrounds that seemed impossibly large, and then back at Jeff. "We go," he said, but it was clear he hadn't thought of a plan yet. He sagged against the doorframe, rubbing his temples and wrinkling his brow, trying to collect his thoughts. "We need a phone," I said, trying to make up for how little help I had been. "We need to call the cops." "The office would have a phone," Alex said. "Everyone has a phone," Jeff said suddenly, the slow realization that we'd come to camp with cell phones, working its way through the weariness. "Yeah, but they're all locked in the closet with the rest of our stuff." "What about them?" I nodded to Ash, who shook his head, trying to mumble his denial around the sock. Jeff was on him immediately, digging in his pockets. He came up with a purple rhinestone-covered cell phone, half charged with a single bar. We all stared at it, unable to believe it was real, and more than one of us broke down, weeping, hugging each other like we'd just discovered some long-lost treasure. And then, Jeff dialed 911. 44 boys were found in the camp after the police had finished going through the cabins. Carl had to be wheeled out of ours on a stretcher, and the small part of me that hadn't gone numb yet thrilled at the sight of the handcuffs linked to the railing. The next few hours passed in a blur of red and blue lights, a sea of concerned faces, and a million questions that sailed in one ear and straight out the other. We were allowed to return, one by one, into our bunks to collect our things after they got the closets open. I grabbed my bag, paused only long enough to see one additional souvenir that I wanted. It was beneath Gloria's bed underneath my clothes. Went back out for my parents. "I thought you'd be skinnier," Dad said as he and Mom, who wasted no time in enveloping me in a crushing hug, walked up later that evening. I gazed at him, wondering if he was seeing the same thing I was seeing. Cops, traumatized children, staff being driven away in the backseats of cop cars. I was filthy, haggard, barely able to stand on my own, and his only concern was my weight. Mom wrapped an arm protectively around my shoulders and scowled at him, but predictably didn't approach him. I let him guide me back to the car, Dad's disappointment burning in my ears, and I watched the camp fade in the distance as we drove home. Huh, did you know they operated out of different locations every year? Said it was so they could bring the program to different regions and make it more accessible, Dad said over breakfast, the morning paper spread out in front of him. Cops say rotating kept the complaints against them spread out and harder to get evidence. By the time anyone investigated, they'd already cleaned up and cleared out. Doesn't matter though. Anyone who worked there is now being charged thanks to whatever they found. In the 2 months since I'd been home, I'd been following the case against the camp very closely and keeping myself informed. The only thing I cared about though was finding out what happened to Evan after he'd been taken to the hospital by Nurse Bianca. And apparently that's where the cops had found him. Underfed, dehydrated, a little delirious, but alive. Beyond that, I didn't want to know the rest of the story. I just didn't want to know. I just wanted to put this whole thing behind me. I've started working out more since I've recovered, channeling my attention into slowly improving my health instead of focusing on all the pain I was working through. Dad continues to berate me, but after dealing with Ash, I found him extremely easy to block out. The therapist I'd begun seeing too said that was a big deal. One day, I'm digging through my bedroom closet. I go in past my clothes and past the stash of untouched junk food and pull out the towel-wrapped souvenir I've kept hidden since my return. Carl's piggy prod waved heavily in my hands. I pressed the trigger, listening to the hum of electricity flowing through it and remembering its bite. I hadn't known why I'd take it. It just had to be an impulse, but now I knew. It served as a reminder. Whenever I feel like I couldn't take that extra step, couldn't resist that last bite, I'd be thinking of the prod, and knew I could overcome anything. I rewrapped the prod and put it back in its place, and I pulled out my running shoes. I was on my way to a healthier, happier self, one tiny, manageable step at a time.